I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture.
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So today, I thought we would chat about a couple heavy topics, but they've been on my mind recently because I actually just got back from a 2-week trip to Thailand, which was such a lovely vacation. But I think it definitely got me thinking about the topic of tourism, like intersections between tourism, gentrification, and then also long-term forms of tourism, like living abroad for longer periods of time. I know, Jennifer, you have some experience being an expat in your high school days.
Yeah, I've done a few expat stints. So when I was in high school, I was an exchange student my sophomore year in Italy. I lived with a family, went to Italian high school. And then when I was doing my coding boot camp back in 2017, I lived in Barcelona in a tech co-living, co-working community. That was definitely like a true digital nomad expat community.
Before it got popular too, because I feel like that term blew up during the pandemic.
It definitely did. It's funny, I've been following this guy, Peter Levels, who founded Nomad List, which is the largest digital nomad site out there. And he was just talking about the history of it on a podcast. And it really rose in 2014, but people didn't really start getting into it until indie hacking came around in 2018 and people started trying to do remote work more, started living abroad. But you're right, after the pandemic, when the world started opening up again, but we still had remote work, it over quadrupled.
Wow. Yeah. I feel like now it's like very popular. I honestly feel similarly about the term expat. I guess in my brain, it feels pretty recent that it became so popular. I was a quote unquote expat when I lived in Kenya for a year and a half when I was 25. As I've gotten further away from that experience, I've just been reflecting a lot more on that term, the various consequences of what it means when you have higher paid people leaving their home countries to go like temporarily stay in a different country for a while. I think especially as it's become much more popular since the pandemic and like more and more countries are coming out with like digital nomad visas and like special benefits to try to encourage foreign workers to come and like replace some of that tourism income that was lost during the pandemic.
I think what has been really interesting about doing research on the topic of gentrification, immigration, migration, even tourism is the shifting words that we use depending on which group of people we're talking about, the connotations of those words and like the political and cultural impact of our language. I literally had to Google what is the difference between an expat and a migrant. Obviously, in our minds, we're like, okay, an expat we think of as somebody from a wealthy country moving to not even necessarily a less wealthy country, but just anywhere for a short period of time. Whereas I think of an immigrant or a migrant conjured up in my mind is probably somebody from a less wealthy country moving to find opportunity elsewhere. An expat, by definition, has to be doing a short-term stint. However, what I found interesting about this is migrant has the exact same definition. An agricultural migrant, like we have a ton of those in the US from Central America, and we don't consider them expats, even though almost definitionally they are the same. The only difference is socioeconomic status.
I feel like the formal definition in this case differs quite a bit from like the cultural connotation, right? Like an expatriate is just someone who is not a citizen of that country, but is working there temporarily. And yet what comes to mind is like, oh, these really uber wealthy, mostly white people who are getting paid exorbitant salaries by big companies to go live somewhere. And their kids are most likely going to really fancy private schools to only make friends in that network and aren't actually absorbed into the local culture. I feel like that's what stereotypically comes to mind. And even like media portrayals, like there's this new show called Expats on HBO.
Really?
Yeah, it's set in Hong Kong. And it's about these like wealthy Americans doing all this fancy stuff in Hong Kong. I haven't actually seen the show as a disclaimer, but Avery's watching it. So I've like seen it in the background. It's not a reality TV show. It's a drama. Like Nicole Kidman is in it playing her typical role of like a damaged, wealthy white woman.
Okay. Checks out.
Whereas when we look at immigration from those poorer countries, we so often call those groups of people the names of why they were forced to leave, right? Like they're refugees or they're migrants or they're seeking asylum, instead of it being expats, total agency that they decided they wanted to leave their home country.
I think that context is what also makes this topic so difficult to dive into, because we have the effects of the past, call it decade, of expats and digital nomads. And I think that's a really interesting topic isolated. But then you start digging into it and you're like, okay, we have all of these centuries of colonialism and gentrification and all of this past history that plays a part into why people feel the way they do about digital nomads and gentrification and Westerners moving into like Asian and South American spaces that I think is really important to the context. But it's so hard to parse out or have a conversation just about the past 10 years without delving into all of that. So I did find it very challenging to come up with my own ideas about if I think this is a good or a bad thing that people are moving around. Is this actually good for the global community or not? And it's so tangled.
Yeah, makes total sense. I guess maybe a diving in point could be first to talk about our own experiences. I think we're kind of in the unique position, maybe less unique now that it's becoming much more of a trend of having actually experienced this ourselves and like spent significant amounts of time outside of the United States. So I'm curious what that was like for you, the things that you felt like you were able to like integrate into the local culture, local society, areas where you felt still removed. And if at that point you felt any like pushback from locals on your status as a quote unquote expat.
Definitely. I think having at the age of 14 done this in a way that I was truly integrated in the culture and I learned the language and my whole point of being there was to integrate has definitely shaped my opinion on this entire subject. Like, I think it's essential that you try to integrate yourself into your host community, no matter who you are. I think there's a level of respect there. And even now when I travel, I try to learn at least a few phrases in the local language. Like, I don't want to be someone that just walks around and is like, hi, can I have this? Like, I want to be able to try and at least show respect. And I struggled with that a lot when I was in Barcelona at 24. I mean, I knew some Spanish. I speak Italian, so I could get away with like Italian Spanish. But they speak Catalan there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know Catalan. I tried. It's really difficult. Then people would just immediately speak back to me in English.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand why. And they did seem a little frustrated with the growing tech community there. And I completely understood why. And I felt very embarrassed almost to be a part of that sort of gentrifying force. Like I don't like feeling like I'm not able to integrate myself. And I knew I was only going to be there for 5 months. I ended up staying for 3 months, but I knew it was going to be somewhere in that range. So it was hard to be like, I'm not going to use all of this time to, make Catalan friends and really learn the language. And so I don't like that feeling. It made me feel like an outsider in a really bad way that I didn't enjoy.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like you were in Kenya for a year.
Yeah, a year and a
right?
half. Yeah.
Yeah.
A little bit cut short because of COVID, but originally we were planning on being there for 2 years. Yeah.
Did you feel like when you moved there, you had intent of integrating yourself, especially because there's an expat community and you were there with a company? I'm curious how that went.
Going in, we knew it would be for 2 years. So I think even that mindset is really different than the mindset of an immigrant, right? Like my parents are immigrants. They came to America from China and they knew they were building an entirely new life. And so it was absolutely necessary for them to learn a language and start to like assimilate into the culture. Whereas for us, I knew I didn't want to have like a tourist experience because obviously living somewhere for 2 years is not the same as being somewhere for a week. But I also knew that, I wasn't going to be able to fully assimilate. And I had experiences in college where these were like much shorter trips, but like I had stayed with a host family for a month. And I also knew this wasn't going to be like that because me and Avery, largely many things in our lifestyle were probably going to stay the same. The food we eat and like the habits that we had already developed would stay the same. It would just be finding an apartment in Kenya, finding new community. And I think the fact that actually I had a tech job really helped me meet local people. In Nairobi, I would say the expat culture is pretty well established. It is a major metropolitan city, and it's actually known as the tech hub of Africa. So there are definitely a lot of expats specifically in tech or like working in startups there. And I think it's easy to meet those folks because you're kind of automatically accepted just by the nature of the fact that you are an expat. And a lot of those people are like also fairly temporary. They're trying to make friends. And so they're like really welcoming to new expats. I think for the locals, I just don't know what their incentive would be to become friends with an expat unless they were like working with you in some other capacity.
Yeah.
So like the friends that I actually made who were from Kenya and then also from Uganda, because I traveled to Uganda very often, like once a month to work with the team there, they were all colleagues. So even if occasionally I would be hanging out with them at a bar and they would introduce me to like one of their friends who didn't work at the company, it's not like I suddenly became friends with that person. It was really just because of the company connection that I was in their circle and they cared to like include me.
Yeah. And in Kenya, do the locals speak English to each other or do they have a dialect or language of their own?
The primary language is English. I mean, same with Uganda, just because of past colonization. There was no language barrier. The only
Wow.
probably visible barrier was just the fact that I look Chinese. So I think there was fewer Chinese expats, for example, than like white British expats. That was very common. And so if anything, it would be less the fact that I was foreign and probably more the fact that I was a Chinese person walking around that would draw attention.
Yeah, that checks out.
Though I was working for this tech startup, like I don't want to give the wrong impression. I certainly wasn't living that expat lifestyle that you see in the media. My salary was adjusted to local standards, right? It wasn't like I was making a ton of US money and like at such a different lifestyle to what I'd be living in the US. Of course, I was making more than many of the local employees in the company. I was also at like a higher level. And so I think that's probably the one element of my work experience there where it was strange because the company that I worked for had 400 employees. Majority of them were from the country that we were operating in. So we operated in Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria. But the leadership was often made up of expats. Our C-level for this company was entirely expats. Our CTO, who was actually West African, and he was like in Uganda. So I guess technically he was an expat as well, but at least he had like local context. It was a strange dynamic.
And yeah, that's interesting that you say that your pay was adjusted to the local standards, because I think for a lot of expats and nomads, that isn't the case. And they are getting paid these kind of relatively exorbitant tech salaries when they're living abroad. Like I saw the average nomad earns a median income of $85,000 a year, which in the communities that they're living in Thailand and Mexico, these are crazy, crazy salaries. And so the good thing about this is they do tend to spend about 35% of their income on food, accommodation, day-to-day essentials, boosting the local economy. On the downside of this, of course, is since they are spending so much on accommodations, a lot of landlords are pricing up their rent for locals in order to drive them out and turn the properties into Airbnbs for digital nomads. And I was seeing a lot of articles, especially in Medellin, Colombia, and in a few places in Mexico, where this is becoming an enormous problem.
And are the governments responding to that, or they're just like letting market forces play out?
You know, it's interesting. I think for the most part, a lot of the local governments are into it because it's really good for the local economies. From the local government's perspective, there really is no incentive to keep the prices low. And we see this also in Western cities. I know New York is having a huge problem with like foreign investors buying up lots of rental spaces. We see it in Nashville. We see it all over the West and Europe as well. So this is not a uniquely South American or Asian problem. This is like worldwide that this is happening.
New York just banned Airbnbs in September last year.
They did?
Yeah.
Is that real though? Is it like actually being enforced?
Yeah.
So I feel like a lot of these local municipalities will say that they're banning stuff and then they don't actually.
Yeah, no, literally you can't have an Airbnb anymore in New York. I mean, I guess it's like still quite early, so we'll see how it plays out. But Airbnb tried to block it in the courts and the case was dismissed. So yeah, it's like such a super complicated topic because on the one hand, you have not only New York, but like several other cities have put out regulation specifically trying to target Airbnb in like the short-term rental market because it has been shown in research that Airbnb definitely does drive gentrification. People buying investment properties makes local housing market prices increase because there's less supply. However, cities like New York also have so many policies that support gentrification. They give tax breaks and change zoning requirements so that big companies, property developers can create these high rises. Gentrification nowadays feels like it happens really, really quickly.
Oh, yeah.
A recent video I saw that the New York Times published about gentrification in Williamsburg, New York, was talking about literally in the last 25 years, Williamsburg has become unrecognizable. And they had this video of Williamsburg in 1999. Just like somebody who had filmed a video driving down the street and it's just a bunch of warehouses. And now it's all of these like luxury stores. Even in the last couple years since I've moved to New York, it feels like an entirely new neighborhood. And that pace is just incredibly fast. Like I'm 30 and now I'm like at the age where I'm reading books about cities that I've actually lived in, like New York, Chicago, talking about even 2015, which was the year I graduated college, and like these neighborhoods being the local bohemia and like all the artists moving into these neighborhoods that had nothing there. And so it was really affordable. And then now that I'm living and experiencing these cities, it's already completely not like that in a matter of 10, 20 years. So I was like, wait, is this just like a feeling or is there like something actually here? And the scholarly research on gentrification pointed this out as well. Gentrification has changed a lot from the 1960s to today. And actually, the wave of gentrification we're in now, which is called third wave gentrification, really only developed since the early 1990s, and it is a state-sponsored gentrification.
What does that mean exactly?
It means that local, state, and county governments are giving property developers the rights to buy up huge parts of land and put in luxury condominiums or luxury high rises, whereas in the years prior to that, the policies were just different. Prior to 1990, the Department of Housing and Urban Development at the federal level was actually very powerful, and they're the government agency responsible for ensuring that there's public housing and affordable housing. And so at the federal level, put in a lot of regulations where they prevented some of the laws and decisions that have been made now. The Department of Housing and Urban Development was really powerful in the 1960s and then had effectively been defanged by the 1990s by changes in politics, people trying to move away from government intervention, a lot of things that Reagan did to disempower this agency. But after they kind of lost a lot of their power is when we see this third wave emerging. If you look at New York City in particular, you can see, and I'll post some links to the articles I read because I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I found it fascinating that you can actually see how a property developer's request got rejected 10 years earlier and then got approved after some of this macro regulation changed.
It's interesting that you say that because I've seen a lot of buzz lately about how there's a luxury high rise being built blocking the view of the Empire State Building on Fifth Avenue. I mean, you live in New York. Have you seen this?
No, but literally this is happening to me.
It is happening to you. That's right. Tell us.
Well, okay, so I live in Brooklyn and I am a renter and we've lived in this building now for a little over a year. We're only 7 floors up, but because Brooklyn is relatively flat from my apartment, I had this great, amazing view of the Empire State Building and the Manhattan skyline. And then literally over Christmas, 2 giant apartment buildings started getting built right in front of my view. And now I can't see anything.
They're humongous.
Sad. And it's
so sad.
Yeah. And it's so funny because I'm not even I don't own this apartment. But when it was happening, I would just look out the window every single day and they would add a new layer. And I very much was oh my God, they need to stop. What are they doing? They're ruining the neighborhood. Someone needs to protest. It was very NIMBY, not in my backyard mindset and rhetoric I was feeling the fire. At this point, it's gone up and I've kind of given up. But while it was happening, I was I can't believe they're just allowed to do that. And I thought that all of the zoning was that you couldn't build buildings above a certain height. And now I'm just totally boxed in.
Well, I wonder if when your building went up, you blocked somebody else's view.
Probably. Yeah, that's the reality.
Yeah. But what's interesting about the Fifth Avenue example is that has been a no-no for basically the entirety of Manhattan's existence, right? You are supposed to look down Fifth Avenue. On one end, you can see the One World Trade Center. On the other end, you see the Empire State Building. And I remember when I lived in New York, I would always use that as am I going uptown or downtown? And literally now this building is blocking it. You can't see it at all. And I guess there's a bunch of city planners and developers that try to make sure that no matter where you are, you can see major landmarks in a city. They do this in Paris, so you can see the Eiffel Tower from most places in the city, etc. And the Empire State Building, of course, is one of those landmarks that they try to do that with, and it's been just completely obliterated. There's also only 12 units, 12 luxury units in this building going up.
What?
Yeah.
Wait, so people own hundreds of floors?
I'm sure there's going to be some commercial use, but for the actual...
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
sure.
But for the actual apartment buildings, don't quote me on this, it's either 12 or 24. I'm almost certain it's 12.
Not that it
but
makes
they're
a huge
penthouses.
difference.
It doesn't make a huge difference, yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I actually just saw this, I think it was on Vice, this woman who did this project where she was not from New York, but she was living here as an artist, and she visited the Empire State Building and saw the view, which is supposed to be obviously an amazing view, even though it's not the tallest building anymore. And she was wow, I'm seeing all these other really, really tall buildings that have even supposedly better, higher up views. What are those buildings? And then she started doing research, found out that a lot of those buildings are just homes for billionaires. They're just extreme luxury condominiums. So she started this project to take photographs of the best views in New York that are usually not accessible to everyday people. And she pretended to be a billionaire, contacted the real estate agents to go view these places.
Wow.
And she made a book of essentially all these photographs she
That's
took
incredible.
in these buildings. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have New York near and dear to our heart, so we can really see the gentrification happening there. But it really is happening all over. For example, in Mexico City, the rent has gone up by 30 to 60% over the past like 3 years.
Mhm.
People have nowhere to go. It's sad that in these communities, it's like people theoretically like us, like in their 30s and just having tech jobs that are doing this. Whereas like in a place like New York City, it's really like the billionaires and the foreign
Mhm.
investors that are having that kind of gentrification impact.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point. I think when you're young and like you make, let's say, okay money, but you're not rich by US standards, I think part of the appeal that I've seen advertised now on TikTok and the rise of this digital nomad is the idea that you're moving somewhere with a far lower cost of living. People who are popularizing this are the ones who are like, I live in Bali and my monthly expenses are only like this couple $100s, which everybody in America who's their audience that they're speaking to is like, wow, that's so affordable. And you can like have such an amazing lifestyle. I mean, I feel like it's similar to the passion economy episode where it's you're sold this dream. The passion economy is like, you can make money so easily, just start blogging about your life or whatever. And I think digital nomad is similar. Like, oh, you don't have that much money or you're in the rat race. It's okay. Come live like a rich prince in this country and you can make your own life better at least by like taking that almost like easy path to having a really high standard of living. And so even young people who are not quote unquote rich, who probably don't think of themselves as a major gentrifying force are because the standards are so different when they move abroad.
Absolutely. And I think what is also unfortunate about this is people don't pay local taxes. So you think you're contributing to the local community, and you are in a sense, of course, you're spending money, but in the same way that tourists spend money. And what would really help is if people were paying taxes in these communities. But I did find it interesting on the positive end of things. The average digital nomad in Thailand was spending 35% of their income in the local communities, which averaged to about $2,500 a month. That equated to almost $20 billion of Thailand's GDP, which was about 3.6% of their GDP just from digital nomads, which is really incredible. And that's without paying taxes, though. So a lot of these countries that have these high digital nomad rates, they're trying to look into how do we get these medium-term visas for people and so they can start collecting some of that income. But I think that would be a really excellent happy medium so they can start regulating it a bit more as well.
I looked at these are some stats on tourism, but I feel like in particular countries whose GDP is largely driven by tourism that have to cater to foreigners, countries who are particularly like susceptible to this. No surprise, it's a lot of the island countries where the weather is beautiful. And so obviously a lot of people want to go there. But the total share of jobs for some of these countries, I'll drop into the video if you're watching on YouTube or if you're watching Spotify video, the image. But I just found it shocking that some of these economies of like Macau, the Maldives, the US Virgin Islands, over 60% of jobs on the island are driven by tourism.
Yeah.
So people can say the digital nomads are so bad, the tourists are so bad, but what can you actually do about it? Of course, in the long term, perhaps these governments can try to like diversify their economies. But in the short term, does that mean like people don't have jobs then if you start turning tourists away?
I think this is a problem that is so complex and different communities feel differently about it. Like I'm thinking specifically of some Caribbean communities versus Hawaii, for instance. There's this big movement right now where local Hawaiians are like, do not come here for tourism. Do not move here. Do not even come here for a week. And the reason behind it is there's a lot of ecological things, like the tourists don't respect the ocean, the reefs, the beaches. So that's one super valid perspective. Another very valid perspective to your point is in St. Lucia, for instance, I'd spent some time there with local people and they all had jobs in tourism. And we were asking about them. And like from the outsider's perspective, you would think they would be really upset with the amount of resorts and tourists. They loved it. They were like, this is the best job. I don't want to go do some like farmer job. I want to go work in a resort. It's amazing. It's the gold standard of what you can do on the island. We have to offer these beautiful beaches and we want people to come here. So yeah, I think there are definitely two sides to that. And I would love to know what makes a community very pro-tourism versus very anti-tourism.
I mean, I feel like the reality is it probably just depends who you talk to. Like when you talked about Hawaii, it brought to mind season 1 of White Lotus. Did you see White Lotus?
I just finished watching it yesterday with my parents.
Oh my God.
It's so funny you say that.
Good. It's really amazing.
Yeah,
I love
it was
that
my second
show.
time watching it. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. These are complicated topics. And I feel like that show actually did a really good job of like that specifically, that example of the local Hawaiian working at the resort so that he could make more money, that being explicitly stated in the show, but then also feeling shitty about it because he was being treated as a spectacle and asked to perform indigenous things to like make the tourists feel entertained. So I totally get why you can want the job for the money, but it can still feel nasty.
Totally.
This kind of also brings to mind voluntourism, right? And just like all of the ethical
Yeah.
dilemmas of when you are a traveler. Because on the one hand, you can have the best of intentions. Like you were saying, you can make efforts. I want to like learn the language. I want to like do good. I want to like have these good intentions, but then it's impossible to control all of the actual effects. I think a lot of the reason voluntourism has come under fire is like you take these often young people from, let's say, the US who do have good intentions, but then they're not educated enough to like know that sometimes the money they're paying to go on their trip or like the greeting of young children in these other countries is not actually benefiting the local community in any way.
No. I mean, I hate to admit this publicly, but when I was in St. Lucia, it was voluntourism. Like I went there with a school group. Okay, I was 13. I'll give myself a little bit of a break, but we were there doing like a summer camp for the local children. And I remember going there, I'm like, we're not helping these people at all, but it's sold to you as if you are. And luckily enough, the hosts of that trip were very aware of this. And the reason that I'm like so anti it is they're like, you're not here for them, you're here for you. You're changing your own perspective here. And while I found that experience to be valuable, I'm also like, it's complete BS. Like we shouldn't just be traveling places under the guise of helping people when they're helping us. It should be under some other nomer or like it's a very like white savior thing. And I feel like really icky about it now.
But I think you're not alone. I mean, I think a lot of people who grew up in America had that be a part of the culture in their high school years. Like church trips. I feel like there was like a million volunteer organizations who part of it was, okay, you volunteer like soup kitchens in your local community, but then also randomly we do like a trip to like Ethiopia or something once a year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is good to get different perspectives and learn from these people, but they try to sell it to you like these people are suffering and we're going to go help them. That's just like not what's happening whatsoever.
Traveling, I think, is a good thing. I think it's totally fine to travel as long as you recognize that it's like for your own benefit. And it's just like actual tourism, not voluntourism.
For sure.
So because I just was on this vacation in Thailand and I had the best time, like I definitely love traveling. I'm always going to do it, even though I know that there are over touristed places and like tourists don't always have the best impact. But like I recognize that and I make the choice still to travel because it 100% benefits me. And like that's how I want to spend my discretionary income. I feel like when I travel, there are things that are touristy or like specifically because I was in Thailand, I think this came up with animal tourism and elephants in particular, which there's a long history of elephant tourism in Thailand that was not very ethical. And in Thailand, local communities will own elephants as a way to like make income. And it was a fast and easy way to make income because you could just sell an elephant ride to a tourist and they would pay you some money and then they'd be gone and you just do it again. I think now there's like much more awareness about the ethics of animal tourism and the fact that as a tourist, you should not be riding elephants ever. But it's also fascinating because when I was on this trip, we saw elephants with an elephant sanctuary. Okay, so they tell this story about how they've like rescued these elephants from elephant camps or like elephant riding situations and given them the freedom to walk around. And so you as a tourist can pay to go and just watch the elephants or like interact with them in designated safe and ethical ways. And when I was doing research for this trip, it was such a rabbit hole of doing research on like, what is the ethical thing to do here? Because I actually feel like many tourists try to like make an ethical decision, but like literally there's hundreds of these elephant sanctuaries in Thailand. Every single one of them has a lot of positive reviews saying like, my experience was great. It did feel ethical. From what I could tell, they were being taken care of. And then there's always like a handful that are like, this is a scam. This is not actually a sanctuary. They're just using this as a marketing tactic to get tourists to sign up because now nobody will touch the unethical stuff. So everybody is rebranding and using this kind of ethical lens. And at some point I was like, wow, is there a right decision to make here? It feels like literally every option is potentially bad. Like you just don't really fully know what is happening behind the scenes.
Yeah.
And Avery and I made the decision like, okay, we narrowed it down to two. One which was cheaper from like a per person cost, said all the right things. And then one that was the OG elephant sanctuary that created all this stuff and was triple the price. And I asked Avery and I was like, which do you think we should do? They both have proponents. They both have detractors. We've already ruled out the ones that are truly fishy. So at this point, which do we do? And he was like, let's just do the more expensive one for peace of mind. So we did.
Honestly.
And it was a great experience, but I just found that to be like a very interesting tourism planning experience.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to animal tourism or even like there's some sites that are like Machu Picchu, I'm thinking of, for instance, they have to really limit the tourism on there because people are like disrespectful, but also just from like the sheer amount of people.
Just the
hiking,
volume.
the volume. You can't
like
handle
your
it.
Footprints.
Mount Everest.
Yeah.
Mount Everest is getting polluted. We're polluting space, like space tourism and like satellites. We're hitting space junk. So like literally anywhere people go, there's pollution. But it's next to impossible to figure out what is ethical and what isn't when it comes to this kind of stuff. But did you feel like when you were there, you had any inkling of like, oh, this is a little bit icky? Or was it completely like, no, this is above table. This is good?
I mean, in my experience, I didn't feel anything icky, but also, again, I feel like it's a total rabbit hole because like a friend was like, you should go see elephants. That's how this all started. And I was like, oh, cool. I'll go see elephants. That's a recommended thing to do. I didn't have any like icky sense at that point. It wasn't until I was like, oh, now I'm doing the research and seeing all of these people commenting this stuff that I was like, oh, okay, now like my hackles are up. Maybe there's something fishy going on here. But I mean, animal tourism is maybe more controversial because obviously it's animals and animals don't have a say over their own bodies and their lives. But
can't consent.
I think this is true of like so many things that you do as a tourist, right? Tourism is inherently a thing that you do for yourself. If you're in a temple in Thailand, for example, and you're asked to like wear appropriate clothing, you should 100% do that. You should not litter. You should like be respectful, but you should also recognize that there is a cost to you being there. And like, I, for one, am like okay with that. Like, I understand that I spent greenhouse gases to like fly to Thailand. And just my presence there is maybe causing some form of gentrification, or the fact that because I'm there spending my money, more shops are going to like cater towards my Western taste, add English to their menus, or like things in the local culture are going to change as a result of me being a tourist. But I just think that's like inevitable.
It's funny that you bring this up because this is actually something I wanted to talk about. It is inevitable, and to an extent I'm fine with it, but in a sense it does make me really sad though. The watering down of cultures and like this rise of sort of a global monoculture.
Yeah.
And that does make me really sad. The examples from South America, it was like the menus are now in English and Spanish, kind of just what you said in Asia, that's happening. And that's not necessarily a problem. But for instance, I was in Amsterdam last year with my fiance who's Dutch, and he couldn't speak Dutch in Amsterdam. That's more due to immigration than it is from tourism. But I think it's sort of two sides of the same coin. And like we call it something different when the population is different, kind of what we were hearkening back to at the beginning of this episode. It's gentrification when it's like white tourists or Western tourists going into these communities, but it's like cultural blending, or it's the natural evolution of culture when it's immigration populations that are changing. And that tapestry is really beautiful. Like I'm thinking of, you have Koreatown, Chinatown, like these different pockets of immigrant communities that make cities really vibrant and diverse and amazing. And then I was reading articles researching gentrification, and now those communities are getting gentrified by like yuppies. And I'm like, that's so fascinating that it's called gentrification when it's already these immigrant communities that probably like 100 years ago when they were getting built, where we would call it something different because it wasn't Western. So we wouldn't call it gentrification, but they were changing their local host community to become like a Koreatown or a Chinatown. And like now 100 years later, we're calling it a gentrification for converting to like a yuppie community. The language around it is really fascinating for what is essentially the same thing of like an evolving, changing local culture due to who's there.
I think in terms of that, though, a changing local culture, I guess, to me is not gentrification. It's only gentrification if it's like wealthier people moving in who are like increasing the cost of things. Whereas historically, like Chinatowns, for example, were relegated to like the poorest parts of the city because it was regulation that didn't let Chinese people live in other areas. So
yeah, 100%.
There were people there that they were displacing, but it was all poor communities. And I feel like gentrification now is more about socioeconomic class, which of course is related to race and like whiteness, 100%.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think the word gentrification has kind of gotten watered down in a sense to mean like a cultural change. Whereas I think to keep its impact, we really do need to talk about it in like the economic, socioeconomic space. Like people getting displaced, just like you said, because rising costs because people are moving in. Whereas it's also getting used to say like the culture is changing. The Chinatown in Chicago, I saw an article about people saying that it didn't feel as authentic as it used to. Like it feels more Western, more like catered to a Western taste than it used to be, where it used to be like very, very Chinese. People were saying, well, yeah, that's because there's more people that have moved in around the area. And I think the true Chinese community has moved to the suburbs. Like it's not actually in that pocket of Chicago anymore.
I see.
But they were calling it like a gentrification of the area, but more in a cultural sense. Like people were referring to it in the cultural way where it's like it's now watered down. It's more Western.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, because also Chinatowns are fascinating because the look of Chinatown, like when you think about Chinatown, you're thinking like the pagoda roofs and like green and red, both in the architecture, but also like paper lanterns, signage, whatever. That look was invented by Chinese immigrants in California, actually, in San Francisco, because it was a way for them to protect their land.
Really?
Chinatowns were considered a really dirty, poor area. And by Chinatown, I mean like actually significant groups of Chinese people were congregated and living there. The government wanted to like push them out. So they adopted this form of almost like Disneylanding their communities so that it would be more of a tourist destination and people would want to come to visit Chinatown, so it would be protected. So like that look by itself is catering to like Western taste. It's taking ideas of Orientalism and China that Western people have and like bringing that here so that Westerners can tour it. Yeah.
That's wild. That's also ingenious. What an ingenious survival mechanism. But holy shit, I had no idea. That's crazy. I mean, they are so fun to visit, though. Like, I love going to Chinatowns. When I was living in Rome, I would intentionally go to like the India town and Chinatown because it was like literally traveling to those places.
Yeah. But it's like you're saying, right? Like, what is culture? What is like the original? That doesn't exist. It's just one on top of each other and like everything is influenced by everything. Is it not original? Is it not Chinese because of this unique history about like bringing this architecture in to please Western tastes? Not necessarily. It just is what it is. And like, that's why this topic of gentrification is so complicated. I feel like in the liberal world, everyone says it's inherently a bad thing and it's displacing populations. But actually, there's been some studies on this that have shown that a city is not like a bathtub. It's not like one drop in means one drop out or it like overfills. Cities are like sponges. And the reality is like people move in and out of cities for so many reasons. And one of those reasons could be housing affordability. But another reason could be just an aging population and like needing to sell your home. And it's actually better for you if you sell your home and it's now worth more because of gentrification than if you can't. And so the studies have shown that actually it's much more complicated than like gentrification is just always bad. For areas that are poor, gentrification can mean that the school system improves, that there's more tax funding, so roads improve, so that it becomes safer, and like that can benefit current residents. Of course, some of those residents are pushed out by the fact that prices are increasing, but you also have rent-controlled areas. If the housing department was doing its job and still had the power to like protect affordable housing in communities, I feel like there would be a better balance.
I think this gets really complicated by the fact that it's not, like in that version of events that you just laid out, it kind of implies that like the people moving in are residents of the new city. But in reality, what's happening, I think, is it's the land owning class, like the landlord class, just buying more and more properties and renting out. And that's what's driving up the cost of everything. And I don't know who that's benefiting other than very few people at the very top. And I think it really is the responsibility of local governments and governments in general to limit the amount of property that one person can possibly have. Because it is unbelievable. Like in the Netherlands, you're not allowed to have more than your primary home and a vacation home. You're not allowed to own any other home, even if it's for renting out. And I think that's such a good rule. We should implement that everywhere. There's no reason for one person to own 50 apartments in New York City. This would, I think, be a much more clear-cut argument because the cost of living wouldn't go up so drastically if it's just each unit, each family unit having one apartment building, one home.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And like with New York City banning Airbnbs now, hopefully that will be a good change, right? Like Airbnbs in New York were found to have driven 9% of the city's rent increases between 2009 and 2016. So Airbnbs in particular, I think, have been a target of a lot of vitriol because people don't even live in those communities. It's just like entirely homes for tourists.
Exactly. And even in these expat nomad communities, like let's take Mexico City, for instance, if there was an allotted 8% of the city, that's the amount of the city that's allowed to be an Airbnb or a short-term rental, it would organically drive up the costs of those rentals. So only so many people can go there and nomad. So you're pricing out so many nomads and keeping the integrity of the local community. Things like that can naturally drive the economic forces to keep these things in check is so important. But otherwise, you're going to have like 30% of the city just being short-term rentals for people who aren't actually a part of the community.
Yeah, the thing you were saying about Amsterdam earlier, Amsterdam actually banned the creation of new tourist shops in 2017. Did you know that?
Really?
Yeah. I so applaud that, right? Because like Amsterdam, it's a small city. They get an overwhelming amount of tourists, which obviously like a lot of other cities do. But I think Amsterdam in particular is just geographically tiny. So there was like part of the city center where they were like, this is not allowed. No more cheese shops, no more Nutella shops. No more of these bicycle shops. Yeah, it's interesting because I think when you take a step back, it's like, wow, these are like such complicated forces. And oftentimes it feels like a lot of conflicting policies are in place, right? Like what we were saying about in New York, the local government letting all these property developers make these giant skyrises, but then at the same time banning Airbnbs, which both seem to be gentrifying forces. So it's kind of like, okay, well, what's going on? Is it just lobbying groups who have different interests who are like weighing in successfully to like create this weird tapestry? But hopefully, I think the optimistic way to look at it is, well, actually, this is just like such a complicated topic. So you can have policies as a city, as a country that promote tourism, but then you can also have policies limiting it and the negative effects. And maybe like, I mean, there's obviously no right answer for every community, but it's more about on a micro level, how is it impacting your community? And if it's leaning one way, more negative or more positive, then I think advocating and like asking your representatives for solutions to help your specific needs. And I think making it much more of a local issue rather than just like this general thing that we all feel like powerless against. Like, of course, gentrification is going to happen. Like, of course, like prices are increasing. I feel like that narrative, which is the narrative that I generally hear living here in New York City, because I'm not that engaged in like local organizing or local politics, but I feel like that's like a very disempowering narrative where it's like the city will do what the city does and it's unaffordable and it'll always be this way.
I feel very strongly that governments need to limit the amount of investment properties and short-term rentals and all these things that we're talking about. Like one person should not be able to own so many properties within a city because that is what's driving up a lot of these costs. But I also think in terms of the ethics of being a gentrifier, so to speak, it really, to me, boils down to like how respectful are you going to be to your host community? Like you need to learn the language, you need to learn the customs, you need to like not go somewhere and expect it to cater to you. Go places, experience things, but again, let yourself change. Don't change the places you're going to, is my 2 cents. Yeah, I don't think we're going to have like a really clear-cut wrap-up thing here, but this was an interesting topic that has so many layers to it.
I feel like this was like a tough one to tackle for sure. I mean, these are 3 really large topics in terms of like what it means to be an expat or an immigrant, the effects of tourism, and then also gentrification. But what I'm particularly interested in is really the intersection of these 3 things. And I thought that since we both obviously been tourists, but also because we've both actually lived abroad for periods of time, and now I'm living in New York, you've lived in New York, we feel daily the existential threat of gentrification as well. It's just been like on my mind a lot. And yeah, it's been fun to talk to you. And thanks everybody for listening.
Thanks, guys.
If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Full transcripts and show notes are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowaboutpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.